It started with laughter, the kind that echoed through the walls of Eleanor's home and made her heart both swell with pride and ache with longing. Her granddaughter, Lily, stood at the center of the family dinner table, her face glowing with excitement as she held her fiancé's hand tightly. Eleanor watched her carefully, her wrinkled hands folded in her lap, trying to ignore the faint sense of unease rising in her chest. The announcement was everything a grandmother should hope for. Lily was getting married to a young man she loved deeply. His name was Daniel, and from the brief moments Eleanor had spent with him during previous family gatherings, he seemed polite, well-spoken, and utterly devoted to her granddaughter. But as Daniel began to speak about his family, his parents, his upbringing, and his roots, Eleanor felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't felt in decades. It was his last name that struck her like a thunderbolt. It wasn't a common surname, nor was it one she had heard often over the years, but it was unmistakable. Her breath hitched, though she forced herself to smile, nodding along with the conversation as the family erupted in cheers and congratulations. She prayed no one noticed the trembling in her hands or the faint flicker of alarm in her eyes. She told herself it was just a coincidence. After all, how many people shared the same name? Yet the way it echoed in her mind felt like a ghost resurfacing, a ghost she had buried so deeply she almost believed it didn't exist. That night, the family toasted to love, to the future, and to the promise of a beautiful wedding. But Eleanor's mind was elsewhere, lost in memories she had worked a lifetime to forget. As the evening wore on, Eleanor's silence went unnoticed amidst the joy and laughter. She excused herself early, claiming fatigue, and retreated to the solitude of her bedroom. Sitting by the window, she looked out at the moonlit garden, her thoughts racing. Her heart pounded with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. The surname wasn't just familiar, it was tied to a moment in her past that had defined her more than anything else, though she had never shared it with anyone. Back then, she was a different person, young, hopeful, and reckless in a way only youth allows. The choices she made in that fleeting summer of her life had shaped the woman she became, but had also left scars, one she had hidden even from those closest to her. She thought of Lily, her sweet granddaughter, who had grown up idolizing her grandmother as a pillar of strength and wisdom. Eleanor had done everything in her power to protect Lily from the hardships she herself had endured, building a legacy of love, trust, and stability for her family. But now, the fragile walls of that legacy seemed to tremble under the weight of the past. She wondered if Lily, or anyone else in the family, could ever understand what she had been through. Could they forgive her if they knew the truth? Would this wedding celebration become a battlefield for secrets and confessions, shattering the very family she had worked so hard to keep together? Sleep was impossible that night. Eleanor paced her room, her mind trapped between the joyous present and the haunting past. Every detail came rushing back. The face of a man she had loved but couldn't keep, the societal pressures that had driven them apart, and the decisions she had made in the name of survival and propriety. She had buried that chapter of her life so deeply that even she had convinced herself it didn't matter anymore. But now, the possibility of it being uncovered was as real as the moonlight streaming through her window. She wrestled with herself, debating whether to say something before it was too late or to cling to the silence that had protected her for so long. The next morning, Eleanor joined the family for breakfast, her face carefully composed, though her mind still reeled. Lily was radiant as she chatted about wedding venues, floral arrangements, and seating charts. "Grandma, you're going to love Daniel's parents," Lily said at one point, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "They're so warm and welcoming. His mom is an incredible baker, and his dad loves history just like you do." Eleanor nodded, offering a faint smile, but her stomach churned. How could she face these people, knowing what she did? How could she celebrate this union while carrying the weight of a secret that could unravel everything? As Lily continued to gush about her plans, Eleanor felt a growing sense of urgency. She realized that the wedding wasn't just a joyful event for the family. It was a ticking clock. With each passing day, the risk of her secret coming to light grew stronger, and she knew she couldn't avoid it forever. For now, though, she resolved to stay silent, to wait and see if her fears were justified. She would protect Lily's happiness at all costs, even if it meant carrying this burden alone for a little while longer. Yet deep down, Eleanor knew the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried. And as much as she tried to convince herself otherwise, she couldn't shake the feeling that the past she had tried so hard to forget was about to collide with the present in ways she couldn't control. The days following the announcement were a flurry of activity. Wedding plans unfolded at lightning speed, with Lily pulling the entire family into the preparations. Eleanor, however, found herself more reserved than usual, staying on the fringes of the excitement. It wasn't that she didn't care about the wedding. On the contrary, she adored Lily and wanted nothing but the best for her. But every time the groom's name came up, Eleanor felt a knot tightening in her chest, a silent warning she couldn't ignore. She began to wonder if she was overthinking things. Could a name alone hold this much power over her? And yet, she knew in her heart that coincidences like these didn't happen without reason. Her suspicions began to grow during a casual phone call with Lily. They were discussing the guest list, a task that Eleanor thought would help ground her mind in the present, when Lily mentioned something innocuous but unsettling. "Daniel's parents are so excited to meet everyone," Lily said brightly. "His mom's been telling me all these funny stories about their family. You know what's so crazy? She said her father used to live in the same small town where you grew up, Grandma. What are the odds?" Eleanor froze, the phone suddenly feeling heavy in her hand. Her throat went dry, and her mind raced through the possibilities. Could Daniel's family really be connected to her past? Was it possible that the son of someone she had once known intimately was now about to marry her granddaughter? She forced to laugh, masking her unease. "Small world, isn't it?" she replied, her voice as steady as she could manage. But after the call ended, Eleanor sat in her armchair, staring blankly at the wall. Memories began flooding back unbidden, of the town she had left behind, of faces she hadn't seen in decades, and of a young man who had once been the center of her world. She thought about Daniel's last name again and pieced it together with what Lily had just told her. It wasn't just a coincidence. It couldn't be. But how much did Daniel's family know? Did they even remember her? And if they did, what would happen when they saw her again? A few days later, Lily invited Eleanor to lunch with Daniel and his parents. Eleanor hesitated but knew she couldn't avoid meeting them forever. When the day arrived, she dressed carefully, choosing a modest outfit that wouldn't draw attention but still reflected her dignity. She told herself she was overreacting, that everything would be fine. Yet as she stepped into the restaurant and saw Daniel's parents seated at the table, her breath caught in her throat. His mother, a kind-looking woman with warm eyes, waved enthusiastically. But it was his father, graying at the temples, his features worn by time but unmistakable, who made Eleanor feel as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. He didn't recognize her at first. His smile was polite, his handshake firm, and his words welcoming. But as they exchanged pleasantries, there was a moment, a flicker of something in his eyes that told her he was searching for a memory. Eleanor kept her composure, years of practice helping her mask the storm inside. She listened as Daniel's mother shared stories about their family, laughing at the right moments and nodding along. But when Daniel's father, Robert, spoke about their roots, Eleanor felt her carefully constructed walls begin to crack. He mentioned the town where they had both grown up, recounting anecdotes that Eleanor knew all too well because she had lived them. She couldn't tell if he remembered her or if she was just a shadow in the corners of his mind, but the tension between them was palpable. After the lunch, Eleanor returned home, her thoughts racing. She couldn't believe what she had just experienced. Robert had been her first love, the man she had been forced to leave behind when the weight of societal expectations became too much to bear. Their relationship had been a secret, one that defied the norms of their time, and it had ended with a heartbreak so profound that Eleanor had sworn never to speak of it again. Now, decades later, his son was about to marry her granddaughter, and the universe seemed to be forcing her to confront the choices she had buried. Eleanor spent the evening pacing her living room, replaying every moment of the lunch. She thought about the stories Robert had shared, the way he looked at her with faint curiosity, as if trying to place her in a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. She wondered what would happen if he did remember. Would he say something to his family? Would Lily and Daniel find out? And more importantly, how would they react if they knew the truth? The thought terrified her. She had always been the rock of her family, the wise and steady presence they relied on. But now, with this secret threatening to surface, she felt anything but strong. As the days passed, Eleanor grew more conflicted. Part of her wanted to pull Lily aside and tell her everything, to explain the connection between their families before someone else did. But another part of her, the part that had kept the secret for so long, couldn't bear the thought of shattering the joy surrounding the wedding. She knew that once the truth came out, nothing would ever be the same. For now, she decided to stay silent, though the weight of her past felt heavier with each passing day. She could only hope that the past would stay where it belonged, though deep down, she knew it was already too late for that. Eleanor couldn't stop thinking about Robert. Every moment alone seemed to invite memories of their time together to resurface, vivid and unrelenting. It was as if the mere act of seeing him had unlocked a door she had sealed tightly for decades. She began to remember every detail of that summer, the one she had spent as a young woman in the town where she was born, where traditions were strong, expectations were unyielding, and love was something whispered about in quiet corners rather than shouted from rooftops. Eleanor had been a spirited young woman back then, headstrong and full of dreams that didn't quite fit into the life her parents envisioned for her. And Robert had been everything she wasn't supposed to want. He was handsome, charming, and full of ideas that challenged the norms of their small, insular community. His family wasn't wealthy like hers, nor were they rooted in the traditions that her parents held so dear. But it was his mind, not just his looks, that captivated her. He talked about a world beyond their little town, a world of possibility, freedom, and self-determination. For the first time in her life, Eleanor felt seen. She spent hours with him, their conversations ranging from books and music to the kind of future they both wanted. It didn't take long for their connection to deepen into something more. Their love was a quiet rebellion, a sanctuary from the expectations that suffocated them both. But their romance was not without its challenges. Eleanor's parents disapproved of her spending time with Robert, seeing him as a distraction from the life they had carefully planned for her. They wanted her to marry someone respectable, someone who would enhance the family's social standing. Robert, with his modest background and ambitious dreams, was seen as a risk, a phase she needed to outgrow. The more they tried to keep her away from him, the more determined she became to be with him. They began meeting in secret, stealing moments whenever they could. Every glance, every touch, felt like an act of defiance against a world that sought to keep them apart. As Eleanor reflected on those days, she could still feel the weight of the decision she had made. She remembered the night she had confessed her feelings to Robert, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. "I don't care what they say," she had told him, her voice trembling but resolute. "I love you, and I want to be with you." His response had been equally passionate, his words a promise to fight for their future together. But the world they lived in wasn't kind to dreamers, and their love was not enough to shield them from the harsh realities they faced. The turning point came when Eleanor's parents discovered the full extent of their relationship. They were furious, their disapproval morphing into outright demands. They forbade her from seeing Robert, and began making arrangements for her to marry a man of their choosing, a man she barely knew, let alone loved. The arguments that followed were some of the most painful moments of her young life. She begged them to understand, to see Robert as she saw him, but their answer was always the same: "You have a duty to this family, Eleanor. Love doesn't put food on the table or keep a roof over your head." Torn between her love for Robert and her sense of obligation to her family, Eleanor made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She met Robert one last time, under the old oak tree where they had spent so many evenings dreaming of a future together. With tears streaming down her face, she told him she couldn't see him anymore. "They'll never let us be happy," she had said, her voice breaking. "And I can't keep fighting them. I'm so sorry, Robert." He had tried to convince her to run away with him, to leave everything behind and start anew, but she couldn't do it. The fear of the unknown, of disappointing her family, was too great. She walked away that night, leaving behind the only man she had ever truly loved. In the years that followed, Eleanor buried the memories of Robert deep within her. She married the man her parents had chosen for her, a good man who provided a stable life but never ignited her soul the way Robert had. She built a family, played the role of a dutiful wife and mother, and eventually found a semblance of peace. But every now and then, she would catch herself wondering what might have been. What if she had been braver? What if she had chosen love over duty? These questions lingered like shadows, never fully answered, always present in the quiet moments of her life. Now, decades later, the past she had tried so hard to forget was staring her in the face. Robert was here, a part of her granddaughter's life in ways she could never have anticipated. She couldn't help but wonder if he remembered her, if he thought about their time together the way she did. And what about Daniel? Did he know anything about his father's past? The thought made Eleanor's stomach churn. She had kept her secret for so long, but now it felt as though the universe was conspiring to force her to confront it. She didn't know what to do, only that the choices she had made all those years ago were about to catch up with her, whether she was ready or not. The wedding day arrived, a brilliant summer morning bathed in golden sunlight and filled with the scent of blooming flowers. Eleanor woke early, her heart pounding with anticipation and dread. The house buzzed with activity as family members flitted about, preparing for the big event. Lily had chosen an outdoor venue nestled in the countryside, its sprawling gardens offering the perfect backdrop for vows of eternal love. The air was thick with joy and excitement, but Eleanor felt the weight of her secret like a stone pressing down on her chest. She had hoped, prayed even, that the day would pass without incident, that her past would remain hidden. But as the hours ticked by, an uneasy feeling began to settle over her. The ceremony was breathtaking, every detail meticulously planned. Lily walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her face radiant beneath the delicate lace of her veil. Eleanor couldn't help but marvel at how much her granddaughter had grown, how she had blossomed into a strong and confident young woman. As the officiant spoke, Eleanor found herself momentarily swept up in the beauty of the moment, the vows of love and commitment stirring something deep within her. But when she glanced at Robert, seated a few rows ahead with Daniel's mother, the past came rushing back with startling clarity. He looked different now, older, quieter, but his presence was a stark reminder of the choices that had brought them both to this moment. After the ceremony, the guests gathered for the reception, a lavish affair under a white tent adorned with strings of twinkling lights. Eleanor tried to immerse herself in the festivities, chatting with relatives and complimenting the decorations. But composure was tested when Daniel's mother approached her with a warm smile. "Eleanor, I've been meaning to talk to you," she said, guiding her to a quieter corner of the garden. "Robert mentioned something interesting the other day. He said you two grew up in the same town. Isn't that funny? All these years, and we never made the connection." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, her hands gripping her champagne glass tightly. Yes, she replied, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. It's a small world, isn't it? She hoped the conversation would end there, but Daniel's mother continued, her tone light and conversational. He said he remembers someone with your name from back then, a young woman who was very special to him. Could it be you? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment, Eleanor didn't know how to respond. She forced a smile, shaking her head. Oh, I'm sure he's mistaken. It was such a long time ago. But the encounter left her shaken. She couldn't ignore the possibility that Robert might remember her, that he might say something to his family. Her fears were confirmed later that evening during the father of the groom's speech. Robert stood at the microphone, his voice warm and steady as he spoke about Daniel's upbringing, his dreams, and his love for Lily. But then his tone shifted, becoming more reflective. You know, he said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, it's funny how life has a way of circling back. Being here today reminds me of someone I once knew, a woman who taught me what it means to truly love, even when the odds are against you. I never forgot her, and I hope she knows how much she meant to me. Eleanor's heart stopped. She felt the eyes of her family on her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and confusion. Lily's gaze lingered, her brows furrowing slightly as if trying to piece together a puzzle she didn't yet understand. Eleanor wanted to disappear, to melt into the background and escape the weight of the moment. But there was no escape. The truth was hanging in the air, unspoken but palpable, and she knew it was only a matter of time before someone asked the question she couldn't bear to answer. After the speech, Eleanor slipped away from the reception, seeking refuge in the quiet solitude of the garden. She wandered among the roses, their fragrance a bittersweet reminder of the past. She thought about Robert's words, the way he had acknowledged their shared history without revealing the full extent of it. Did he know she was here? Was he trying to reach out to her, or was it merely a coincidence? Her thoughts were interrupted when Lily appeared, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the garden lights. "Grandma," Lily said, her voice gentle but insistent. "Can we talk?" Eleanor nodded, her heart sinking. She knew this moment would come, but she wasn't prepared for it. They sat on a bench beneath an old oak tree, the same kind of tree where Eleanor had once shared her dreams with Robert. Daniel's dad, Lily began hesitantly. He said something during his speech. It sounded personal. "Do you know him, Grandma? I mean, did you know him before today?" Eleanor hesitated, her mind racing for the right words. She had spent her entire life protecting her family from the truth, and now, in the span of a single day, everything was unraveling. Yes, she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew him. A long time ago." Lily's eyes widened, and Eleanor could see the questions forming in her mind. "What happened?" she asked. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" Eleanor sighed, the weight of her secret pressing down on her like never before. "It's a long story," she said, her voice trembling. "One I never thought I'd have to tell." As she began to speak, the words came slowly at first, hesitant and heavy with emotion. She told Lily about her past, about the love she had shared with Robert and the choices that had torn them apart. She didn't sugarcoat the truth, nor did she try to justify her decisions. She simply told her story, hoping that Lily would understand. By the time she finished, Lily's expression was a mixture of shock and empathy. "Grandma," she said softly, "I had no idea. I can't imagine how hard that must have been for you." Eleanor nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It was," she admitted. "But I thought I was doing the right thing for my family, for myself. And now, after all these years, I'm not so sure." The conversation ended with a quiet hug, the kind that spoke volumes without words. But Eleanor knew this was only the beginning. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The days after the wedding felt like walking through a storm. Eleanor had known the truth would ripple through her family, but she hadn't anticipated the depth of its impact. It started with Lily. Though she had listened compassionately during their garden conversation, the revelation left her unsettled. The next morning, she called Eleanor, her voice tinged with confusion. "Grandma, I've been thinking about what you told me. I understand why you kept it a secret, but why now? Why didn't you ever tell Mom or Dad?" The question hung in the air, and Eleanor struggled to find an answer that didn't sound hollow. "I thought I was protecting everyone," she said softly. "I thought it was better this way." But the family didn't feel protected. They felt blindsided. By the end of the week, word of Eleanor's past had spread through the family, and the reactions were as varied as they were intense. Lily's parents, Eleanor's son and daughter-in-law, were hurt and confused. "Mom," her son said during a tense phone call, "how could you keep something like this from us? Don't you think we had a right to know?" His voice was calm, but Eleanor could hear the undercurrent of disappointment. "You've always been the one we looked up to, the one we trusted. And no, I don't know what to think." Eleanor tried to explain, but the more she spoke, the more she realized how impossible it was to convey the complexities of her decisions. How could she explain the societal pressures, the fear of rejection, the weight of choosing between love and duty? "I didn't tell you because I didn't want this," she said finally, her voice cracking. "I didn't want you to look at me differently. I didn't want to hurt you." Her son sighed, the sound heavy with emotion. "I get that, Mom. But secrets like this, they don't just stay buried. They have a way of coming back." It wasn't just her immediate family who struggled. Lily, torn between her love for her grandmother and her loyalty to her fiancé, found herself questioning everything. "Daniel keeps asking me if I'm okay," she confided to Eleanor during another call. "He knows something's bothering me, but I don't know how to tell him. How do I explain that his father was once the love of your life?" The question left Eleanor speechless. She hadn't considered how her past might affect Lily's relationship, and the realization was like a punch to the gut. "You don't have to tell him everything," Eleanor said after a long pause. "This is my burden, not yours." But Eleanor's burden wasn't so easily contained. The tension came to a head during a family gathering the following weekend. Lily had invited both sides of the family for a casual barbecue, hoping to ease the strain. Eleanor arrived with trepidation, unsure of how she would face everyone. The air was thick with unspoken words, and the atmosphere, usually lively and warm, felt stilted and uneasy. Conversations were polite but strained, and Eleanor could feel the weight of her family's collective gaze. The moment she had dreaded came when Robert approached her, his expression unreadable. "Eleanor," he said quietly, gesturing toward a quieter part of the yard. "Can we talk?" She followed him, her heart pounding. They stood under a large oak tree, the chatter of the barbecue fading into the background. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Robert broke the silence. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I didn't know you were here, or that our families were connected." "If I had known," he trailed off, his words heavy with unspoken regret. Eleanor shook her head, her eyes misting. "It's not your fault," she said. "This was bound to happen eventually. I spent my whole life trying to forget, but the truth always finds a way, doesn't it?" Robert nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I never forgot you, Eleanor. I thought about reaching out so many times, but I didn't know if you'd want to hear from me. And now seeing you here, with our families so intertwined, it's overwhelming." Eleanor felt a pang of sorrow, a bittersweet reminder of what they had once shared. "I never forgot you either," she admitted. "But I had to let go. I had a family to think about, and I didn't want to hurt them." Their conversation was interrupted when Lily approached, her expression hesitant. "Are you two okay?" she asked, glancing between them. Robert offered a reassuring smile. "We're fine, sweetheart. Just catching up." But Eleanor could see the questions in Lily's eyes, the uncertainty that lingered despite his words. The rest of the day passed in a haze of awkward interactions and half-hearted attempts at normalcy. By the time Eleanor returned home, she was emotionally drained. That night, as she sat in her favorite armchair, staring at the family photos lining the walls, she felt a wave of guilt wash over her. She had always prided herself on being the glue that held the family together, a steady presence they could rely on. But now she felt like the source of their discord, the one who had disrupted their sense of stability. She wondered if she had made the right choice all those years ago, or if she had only traded one kind of pain for another. As much as she tried to convince herself otherwise, she couldn't escape the feeling that her family might never see her the same way again. But even in the midst of her despair, Eleanor clung to a small thread of hope. The past had resurfaced. Yes, but perhaps it was an opportunity for healing, for understanding. She had spent so long hiding her story, but now that it was out in the open, maybe, just maybe, it could bring her family closer in ways she had never imagined. For now, all she could do was wait and see if time would soften the edges of their pain, and if love, the kind she had always believed in, could bridge the gaps her secrets had created. Eleanor sat in the living room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, waiting for the family meeting Lily had called earlier that day. It had been 2 weeks since the wedding, 2 weeks of strained conversations, awkward silences, and sidelong glances. She knew that Lily's decision to gather everyone was meant to clear the air, to address the questions and emotions that had surfaced since the truth was revealed. But Eleanor felt more nervous than she had in years. Would this be a moment of healing, or would it tear the family apart further? The room slowly filled with familiar faces, each one marked by a different expression: curiosity, apprehension, even a hint of frustration. Lily sat beside her fiancé, her hand resting lightly on his. Eleanor's son and daughter-in-law sat across from her, their gazes unreadable. And then there was Robert, sitting quietly in the corner, his presence a reminder of everything Eleanor had tried to leave behind. The room was charged with unspoken words, the kind of tension that made every breath feel heavier. Lily began, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her eyes sweeping the room. "I know the past few weeks have been difficult, and I think it's time we talked openly about what's happened. This isn't just about Grandma's past, it's about how we move forward as a family." Eleanor's chest tightened. She had spent a lifetime protecting her family from the truth, and now here it was, laid bare for everyone to see. She took a deep breath, preparing herself for what was to come. It was her son who spoke first, his voice calm but firm. "Mom," he said, looking directly at her, "I've been trying to understand why you kept this from us for so long. I get that it was a different time, that you faced pressures we can't fully comprehend. But it's hard not to feel betrayed. You've always been the one we turned to for guidance, and now it feels like we didn't really know you." His words cut deep, but Eleanor could hear the pain behind them, the longing for answers. "I understand how you feel," she replied, her voice trembling. "And I don't blame you for being hurt. I made choices that I thought were best at the time, but those choices came with consequences. I was afraid of what the truth would do to this family." Robert cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "If I may," he began, his tone gentle, "I think it's important to remember the context of those choices. Eleanor and I, we lived in a world where love wasn't always enough. We were young, and the odds were stacked against us. She made a decision to protect her future, and while it was painful, I don't think it was wrong. It was just what had to be." His words hung in the air, a mixture of understanding and regret that resonated deeply. Eleanor looked at him, gratitude and sorrow mingling in her expression. "Thank you," she said softly. "But the truth is, I've spent my whole life wondering if I made the right decision. I thought I was protecting my family, but maybe I was just protecting myself from the pain of confronting what I lost." She turned to her son, her eyes brimming with tears. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I didn't know how. And I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd see me differently." Lily spoke next, her voice steady but emotional. "Grandma, I don't see you differently. If anything, I see you more clearly now. You've always been my role model, the person I look up to most. And knowing what you went through, the sacrifices you made, it only makes me respect you more. But I think it's important for all of us to remember that the past doesn't define who we are. It's how we move forward that matters." Her words seemed to strike a chord, and for the first time that evening, the tension in the room began to ease. Eleanor's son nodded slowly, his expression softening. "I think Lily's right," he said. "We can't change the past, but we can choose to understand it. And, Mom, I want you to know that no matter what, you're still the person I've always loved and admired. This doesn't change that." Eleanor felt a wave of relief wash over her, but the moment was bittersweet. She had spent so long hiding her truth, and now that it was out in the open, she realized how much she had underestimated her family's capacity for love and forgiveness. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you all for listening, for giving me the chance to explain." The evening ended with quiet conversations, the kind that hinted at healing. Eleanor sat with Robert briefly, the two of them sharing a moment of reflection. "I'm glad we had this chance," he said, his eyes kind but weary. "It's not the future we dreamed of, but it's something, isn't it?" Eleanor nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "It is," she agreed. "And maybe it's enough." In the days that followed, Eleanor noticed a subtle shift in the family dynamics. The conversations were more open, the connections deeper. She found herself spending more time with Lily, who often asked questions about her youth, eager to learn more about the woman behind the stories. And while there were still moments of awkwardness, moments where the weight of the past lingered, Eleanor felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The story ended not with dramatic revelations but with quiet resolutions, a family choosing to come together despite the secrets that had once divided them. And for Eleanor, it was a reminder that love, in all its forms, was worth fighting for, even when it came with challenges. As she watched her family grow stronger, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, a belief that the choices of the past didn't have to dictate the future. In the end, the truth hadn't torn them apart, it had brought them closer in ways she never could have imagined.